Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
Are you ready for a shocking truth? Because last night, at what was supposed to be my birthday dinner, the kind of evening where maybe for once I could just exist without being dragged into the old family script, my dad leaned back in his chair, chuckled in that loud way of his that always makes every table in the restaurant turn, and said the line he has been repeating for years like it is some kind of inside joke the rest of us should all laugh at. We all know your sister is the real success here. It landed with that same dull thud in my chest that it always has, except this time something different happened. Sitting right beside me was my boss, Daniel Carter, who had joined the dinner after work because the team had brought a cake and insisted he come along, and instead of politely smiling and letting the family dynamic play itself out in front of him, he tilted his head, gave this almost amused smile, and said, "That's strange. She just applied for a job at my office." And in that moment, it was not me who froze, or who burned with humiliation, or who tried to come up with a clever comeback. It was my sister, Ava, who suddenly looked like she had swallowed a stone, because now the one thing she had been trying to keep secret had been put right on the table, and not by me. I sat there, in that moment, realizing the game had changed without me even moving a piece. For years, Ava had been the shining star, the one dad held up as the example of how things should be done, the one mom coddled whenever responsibility might touch her, the one whose mistakes were always learning experiences, while mine were framed as character flaws. And yet here she was, desperately trying to slip into the very place where I had built something real with my own work, hoping maybe nobody would notice. She had quietly borrowed pieces of my portfolio to pad her way in. I remembered the missing flash drive from months ago, the casual way she had said she had to borrow my laptop for a quick look at something, the way she brushed off my suspicion with a smirk. I had let it slide then, thinking maybe I was paranoid, maybe it was nothing, because that's what I had been trained to do in this family, doubt myself before doubting Ava. But Daniel's words were like a stone dropped into water, and the ripples spread instantly across the table. Mom's eyes darted between me and Ava like she could somehow redirect the conversation by sheer force of will. Dad tried to chuckle again, but it came out strained, as though he knew the joke had finally stopped being funny. And Ava, my golden sister, sat stiff as a board, her smile stretched thin, mumbling something about how she was just exploring options. The silence that followed was heavy enough to choke on, and for the first time in a long time, I felt no need to fill it. Instead, I raised my glass, forced a smile, and said, "Well, here's to Dad for always keeping us humble. And here's to Daniel, who knows how much we value clear attribution at work." It was light, it was civil, but it was also deliberate, and Daniel caught the meaning. His eyebrow lifted just enough to say he understood more than anyone else at that table. For once, I didn't have to push back or defend myself, because the truth was already dangling in the air, undeniable and sharp, and it wasn't me holding the knife. We ate the rest of the meal in a kind of uneasy truce, everyone pretending nothing had happened, except every fork scrape on the plate felt like a reminder that something very big had just shifted. By the time dessert came, Ava had retreated into silence. Mom was fussing over the bill as if that could distract from the tension, and Dad kept making strained small talk about the weather, sports, anything but what was hanging between us. I sat there calm, not because I wasn't rattled, but because for once the weight wasn't on me to fix it. I could let it sit, and it would sit heavy. When we finally left the restaurant, Daniel walked with me to the parking lot. He didn't say much at first, just gave me a long look, the kind that tells you someone is adding things up in real time. Then he said quietly, "We should talk first thing tomorrow. Bring whatever you have." That was it. He didn't accuse, didn't explain, just let me know that this was no longer a family drama confined to holiday dinners. It was a matter that now lived in the professional world, where the rules are different, where proof matters more than charm, and where favoritism can't rewrite the facts. I went home that night replaying the moment again and again, not with the usual sting of humiliation, but with a kind of clarity I had never felt before. The years of biting my tongue, of swallowing the comparisons, of letting Ava's little digs slide because it was easier than being accused of jealousy, suddenly all of it looked different. The truth was finally sitting in the open, and this time, I had no reason to cover it back up. The next morning, just as I was pouring coffee, my phone buzzed. A message from Daniel. 5 words, "We'll sort this out properly." And that was the moment I knew everything was about to change, and not just at work, but in the very heart of my family. Do you want to know what happens when the family golden child's mask slips in front of the one person you can't afford to fool? That's where this story is going. By the time the sun was even pretending to show up, which is my way of saying it was the kind of early when the apartment is quiet and the coffee is the only thing that seems to believe in you, I had already decided that if the dinner cracked something open, then today would be the day I stopped taping it back together. So I pulled the box from the top shelf where I keep old project folders, and I opened the drive that I back up every week, because I have learned the hard way that memory is a liar. But timestamps are not, and I started laying out the work the way a grown woman lays out facts, when she is done apologizing for having them. I collected the drafts from the nonprofit launch project with the file name trail that shows initial concept notes, revised audience segmentation, stakeholder feedback, and the final report with the distinctive phrasing I use for the part where we quantify what happens when people do nothing, the cost of doing nothing math that sounds almost obvious until you actually calculate the lost donations, the attrition in volunteer hours, and the way momentum dies when no one names the consequence out loud. And as I scrolled those paragraphs, a sick little jolt rippled through me because the exact sequence of ideas appeared in the screenshots Daniel had forwarded from the application portal as examples from Ava's portfolio. Except the numbers were rounded and the dates were shifted and the examples were stripped of the messy internal notes that make a thing real. I remembered, with the kind of slow dread that starts in your stomach and moves up your spine, the night months ago when Ava breezed through my place for what she called a quick laptop borrow because hers was running updates. The way she laughed when I asked why she needed admin access for just checking a file, the coy little shrug when my flash drive went missing a week later, and she said she must have seen it at my office, so maybe I had left it there, and how I told myself that accusing my sister of snooping would only make me look paranoid, because for years that has been the reflex they have trained into me. Do not make a scene, do not escalate, do not be the reason anyone is uncomfortable. I poured another cup of coffee and I decided I was done protecting everyone from discomfort that belonged to them. When I walked into the office, Daniel was already there, sleeves rolled, that focused expression that means he plans to treat a mess like a process rather than a scandal. And before he could even ask, I set the binder on the table and opened my laptop to a simple document with 2 columns, the left labeled Original and the right labeled Submitted Portfolio. Because if I was going to do this, I would do it in a way that no one could argue with, and I scrolled point by point through phrasing, structure, and data trail, adding the email headers that show when my team received client sign-off and when the final metrics came in from the platform. And I watched Daniel's face shift from curiosity to recognition to something I can only describe as steady resolve. Not the dramatic kind that asks for a scene, but the professional kind that says, "We are moving this to the lane where it belongs." He asked me how I wanted to handle any conflict of interest given that the applicant is my sister. And before the question even landed, I said the sentence I had been shaping all morning, which was that I would recuse myself from any hiring discussion now or later, that I would provide documentation, and that after this meeting I would direct all questions through HR because I am not going to use the office to settle a family score, and he nodded once like he had been waiting to hear that I understood the difference. We looped in HR with a short message that included the side-by-side document, a zip file with creation dates and version history, and a brief note from me that read, in words I chose carefully because I wanted them to feel like a boundary rather than a complaint, that the applicant is my younger sister and that to protect the company and myself I am stepping back from all evaluation while providing evidence that some of the materials in her submission appear to be derived from my team's work, without attribution. And as soon as I hit send, I felt the strangest combination of grief and relief. Grief that it had come to this, and relief that I was done pretending it had not. HR is not warm or cold. HR is a process. And the reply we got within the hour was exactly that tone, an acknowledgement of receipt, a statement that verification had begun. and a request for any additional artifacts related to volunteer hours that Ava had claimed in her cover letter, which stopped me because I have never once seen Ava volunteer for the nonprofit beyond attending the gala and taking photos, yet there it was on the screen, a line about leading outreach for 3 months and coordinating a grant proposal, which, unless she did it on another planet, did not happen in this one. I am not going to lie and say I did not feel mean for a minute, because the oldest script in my head kicked up its usual smoke about loyalty and family and how we should fix things privately, but every time that script tried to take over I looked at the document, at my team's names on the headers, at the hours spent in the weeds with people who trust me to defend their work, and something inside me lined up and held position. So I opened my email again, and I sent HR the calendar invites, the sign-in sheets, and the board minutes showing who actually logged those volunteer hours, which were not Ava, and when Mom texted to ask how the morning was going because Dad had come home upset and embarrassed, I wrote back one sentence that told the truth without inviting a negotiation, which was that the hiring process would follow company policy and that I would not discuss it further. If you are wondering whether I enjoyed any of this, whether there was some vindictive spark that made the coffee taste sweeter as I hit send, the messy truth is that there was no joy. Only a clear sense that I had stepped from the fog into the lane where consequences live, and once I stood there I did not plan to move, and maybe that is what growing up looks like when your family lives on punchlines, not when you finally get a better joke, but when you stop laughing along. Late in the afternoon, Daniel pinged me to say that HR had flagged discrepancies and that references were being contacted, and as I closed my laptop I saw Ava's name flash on my phone along with a message that was half plea and half accusation, asking why I would do this to her when she was only trying to build a future, and I stared at the screen for a long beat before typing that I hoped she would build one, honestly and with credit where it is due, and that I would help her find the training to do that if she wanted, but that I would not bend the truth to make it easier, because easy is how we got here. And then, as if the universe wanted to underline what comes next, an email from HR arrived with a line that made me sit up straighter than I had all day, because it said they needed to discuss the claimed nonprofit hours in more detail. And they had questions about a project lead title listed on her resume that none of the references could confirm, which is where I will leave you for now, hanging on the same quiet breath I am holding, because the next move will not happen in a dining room or a group chat. It will happen in a room where names and dates and signatures decide who gets to tell the story. When HR confirmed that parts of Ava's resume could not be verified, I knew the fallout was coming, but before any of that hit my desk I realized there was another piece of the story I had ignored for far too long. The part that had nothing to do with portfolio theft or job applications, and everything to do with the invisible ways my family had kept a grip on me through money, obligations, and the kind of shared accounts that always sounded temporary, but somehow never ended, and I decided if I was really going to stop playing by their rules, then the financial strings they pulled every time they wanted me to shut up had to be cut once and for all. For years the arrangement had been presented as a convenience, the family phone plan that was supposed to save us all money, but in practice left me paying over half because I earned more. The so-called emergency loan my parents gave me in my first year out of college, which they had repeated so many times in front of relatives that it felt like my identity was stamped with gratitude, even though I had paid it back in full within 12 months and still found myself listening to stories about how I never could have gotten started without their help. The constant assumption that because I was the one with stable employment, I would cover holiday tickets or last-minute hotel deposits or joint gifts that somehow never got split. Every single piece of it was framed as love, but it was really leverage. And leverage has a way of showing up in the most convenient moments, like when Dad made his little birthday comment and followed it up the next morning with a lecture about how family unity matters more than technicalities at work. That morning I opened my bank app, pulled the statements, and highlighted every single payment I had made for the phone plan, the travel charges that had come from my card, the deposits that were framed as temporary but were never returned. And I built a spreadsheet that made the pattern undeniable, not for them but for me, because I needed to see in black and white what I had allowed to continue under the label of family loyalty. Then I dug into the text threads, the ones where Ava had messaged me, "Can you put it on your card and I'll Venmo later?" and then never did. The ones where Mom had promised to straighten out the plan with the provider next month and never called. The ones where Dad reminded me that it's all one pot anyway, as though my paycheck automatically belonged to a collective that never seemed to contribute in my direction. I copied the relevant lines, pasted them under the matching transactions, and stared at the total, which was large enough to make me feel both furious and ashamed. Furious at them for exploiting it and ashamed at myself for letting it happen because I was so conditioned to keep the peace. When the document was finished, I drafted a message to the family group chat. Not long, not angry, just clear. I explained that effective immediately, I was removing myself from all shared financial accounts, that the phone plan would be transferred within 10 days, that autopays linked to my card would be canceled, and that any outstanding balances needed to be settled by the end of the month. I attached the spreadsheet and wrote a final line that said, "Unity is built on truth, and this is the truth." I hit send and set my phone down, and for the first time in years I felt the kind of silence that is not empty but freeing. Of course the responses came fast, Mom insisting this was unnecessary drama and that I was embarrassing the family by reducing our relationships to dollars and cents, Dad demanding to know why I was punishing Ava when she was already under enough stress. Ava herself firing off a string of messages that shifted from denial to outrage to pleading in the span of 15 minutes, saying she would have paid me back if I had just been patient and asking why I was suddenly acting like an enemy. I read them all, closed the thread, and did not reply, because I knew that any reply would pull me back into the endless loop of excuses and accusations, and I was done spinning. The practical steps felt almost anticlimactic: calling the provider, transferring the plan, closing the joint credit account that had been opened for emergencies but never used except for Ava's impulse purchases, canceling the hotel rewards card that had my name on it but their charges running through it. Each confirmation email felt like a small cut through a net that had kept me tangled for years, and by the end of the afternoon I was lighter, not because money buys freedom, but because clarity does, and I finally had it. That evening Ava called, her voice trembling between anger and fear, telling me that HR had put her interview on hold pending verification and that I was destroying her life, that Dad was furious with me for dragging the family through the mud, and that if I really cared I would call Daniel and smooth it over. I let her finish. Then I said calmly, "I'm not interfering in the process, Ava. That's the point. And as for Dad, unity doesn't mean silence when someone lies." She hung up without answering, and for once I didn't chase her with apologies or explanations. Later that night, I sat at my kitchen table looking at the cleared accounts, the canceled autopays, the spreadsheet neatly saved under a folder called Boundaries, and I realized that cutting the financial strings was not just about money. It was about refusing to let anyone buy my compliance with guilt. And while it might not sound like revenge in the traditional sense, I can tell you this: when the levers they have used for years suddenly no longer exist, when the excuses no longer come with an invoice attached to your account, it is the kind of quiet revenge that makes people panic because they realize they have lost the control they thought they owned. And just as I was closing my laptop, a new email from HR arrived with a subject line that made me sit up straighter: verification discrepancies, next steps. It meant the process was moving forward, not on my word, but on the strength of evidence, and that is when I understood that the fight was no longer about proving my worth to my family. It was about refusing to let them define it in the first place. And that realization was the sharpest cut of all. By the time HR sent their second message with the phrase "significant discrepancies" bolded in the middle of the text, I already knew what it meant. Not because they had spelled it out in detail, but because I had lived long enough around Ava to recognize the familiar fingerprints of exaggeration and fabrication that had always been brushed aside at home as ambition or charm, and now, in a professional space where verification comes in the form of reference calls and time-stamped records rather than family stories, those fingerprints were starting to look more like evidence than personality. The document attached listed the areas they could not confirm: The project lead title she had proudly put on her resume never existed in any official record. The volunteer hours she had claimed for the nonprofit had no corresponding sign-in sheets or board acknowledgments, and the reference who had supposedly supervised her during a campaign had reported she was only present for a single shadowing week, which she later posted about online as though she had run the whole initiative. I sat at my desk reading the words slowly, feeling the kind of grim validation that does not bring joy but does bring a clarity so sharp you can barely look at it without wincing. And I thought about how many times I had let that same pattern wash over me in smaller ways. The borrowed outfit that never returned, the group project in school where I did the work and she made the speech, the family gatherings where she told my stories as if they were hers because she knew no one would bother to check the details. When Daniel stopped by my office later that morning, he did not close the door, because he wanted this to feel transparent rather than secret, and he told me that HR was continuing their process, that I was to remain outside the evaluation entirely, and that under no circumstances was I to feel guilty for any of it, because once an application enters the system, it belongs to the rules of the system and not to family politics. He thanked me, and not in the perfunctory way managers sometimes do, but with that deliberate tone that means he has thought about what it must have cost to bring forward the evidence without collapsing into personal bitterness. And then he added something I did not expect. He asked me if I would be willing to lead a team session the following week on ethical attribution, the kind of internal workshop that normally gets farmed out to consultants, but which he said I had already demonstrated in practice by how I handled this situation. For a moment I sat frozen. Because while I wanted to say yes, part of me hesitated, knowing that standing in front of colleagues and talking about ethics, while my own sister was at the center of an investigation, could look like a performance. But then I realized that the entire point was to step into the room that mattered and show, not tell, that our work culture was built on facts and respect. So I said yes, and that afternoon I began outlining a session that focused less on rules and more on the human cost of stolen credit, the hours erased when someone else's name sits on your work, the way it chips away at motivation, the way it silences creativity because people stop taking risks if they believe their contribution will be stolen. I used real anonymized examples from past projects, not the one involving Ava, but ones from years back where attribution had been sloppy and morale had suffered, and I framed it as a conversation rather than a lecture, because I wanted the team to own the standard, not feel lectured into it. When the day came, the room filled up more than expected, people pulled chairs from the hallway, and as I spoke I felt something I had not felt at home in a long time, the experience of being listened to without interruption, of having my words taken at face value rather than filtered through comparisons. At the end, Daniel stood and said, "This is the model for how we protect each other's work," and he gestured toward me in a way that made it clear my role was not background but center. Meanwhile, outside that office, the family theater continued. Mom called twice with the same trembling plea, asking me to fix it, as though my silence could rewrite records, as though my refusal to intervene was the betrayal rather than the lies themselves. Dad posted a photo on social media of both of us, me and Ava, captioned with, "Proud of both my girls. Competition only makes you stronger," a line that was less pride and more accusation. A subtle dig implying that the problem here was sibling rivalry rather than misconduct. The comments rolled in from extended relatives congratulating Ava on her ambition, asking me in private messages why I couldn't just let her have her chance, and for a brief hour I felt the old pull to defend myself, to send receipts, to prove my side. Until I closed the app and reminded myself that the only rooms that mattered were the ones where truth shaped outcomes, HR offices, project meetings, team sessions where attribution became policy rather than a suggestion. That night, sitting in the quiet after the workshop, I thought about what revenge actually means. It is not always slamming doors or dramatic confrontations that leave everyone gasping. Sometimes revenge is as simple as refusing to play the role you were written into and instead walking into a different room entirely, one with rules you respect, one where evidence speaks louder than favoritism, one where you are finally recognized not for being the sister of someone but for the work you put your name on. And while my family might never admit that truth, The faces of my colleagues that afternoon told me everything I needed to know. But of course, the story wasn't finished, because as the workshop ended and people drifted out, Daniel leaned over and told me that HR's next step would involve notifying Ava officially that her application was being closed due to misrepresentation, and that I should be prepared for the fallout, because once that letter hit her inbox, the storm would not stay inside her head. And I knew he was right, because storms in my family never stayed quiet. They spilled into every room they could find, except this time I had already chosen mine, and I was not leaving it. When HR finally closed Ava's application with the official note that the discrepancies were too significant to overlook, the message landed in her inbox, but ricocheted straight into mine through the sound of my phone vibrating late at night. Because I knew before I even picked it up that she would call, and she did, her voice thick with panic and fury, accusing me of ruining her future and telling me that if I had just stayed quiet no one would have known, that families were supposed to protect each other, not drag each other down. I let her words spill for several minutes, the same mixture of self-pity and blame that I had heard my whole life, and when she finally paused for air I told her calmly that I hadn't dragged her anywhere, that she had written the application. She had copied the work, and she had invented the hours, and that all I had done was refuse to cover for her this time. There was silence on the line so heavy that I could hear her breathing, and then she hung up, leaving me sitting in the dark with the quiet hum of the refrigerator and the certainty that the break between us was no longer something that could be patched with apologies over holidays. The next morning, I asked my parents to meet me for coffee, not at their house where Mom could control the tone with casseroles and distractions, not at a restaurant where Dad could turn everything into a performance for the server, but at a small cafe near my office where I knew the only thing on the table would be words and receipts. I brought a folder, not because I wanted to make a show, but because I had learned that conversations with my parents always slipped into gaslighting unless paper held the line, and when we sat down I slid it across to them without ceremony. Inside were the bank statements, the phone bills, the IOU text printouts, and a one-page letter I had typed the night before, a letter that spelled out exactly what I would and would not accept from here on. I wrote that I would not attend family events where I was publicly diminished, that I would not allow comparisons of my career to Ava's as a party trick, that I would not fund any more shared expenses or loans disguised as obligations, and that if Ava wanted help building skills, I would provide her with a mentor introduction and a certification path, but only if she wrote in her own words what she actually wanted to learn instead of stealing from others. My father's face darkened as he flipped through the pages, muttering that I was turning family into a courtroom, while my mother sighed heavily and tried to appeal to my softer side, asking why I couldn't just forgive and move on, but I sat there steady, sipping my coffee and reminding myself that forgiveness without change is just permission, and I was done giving permission. I told them that for years they had mistaken my silence for agreement, but that silence was over, and whether they liked it or not, the dynamic had shifted. They did not have to approve, they did not have to congratulate me, but they would have to adjust, because the levers they had pulled, money, guilt, favoritism, were gone, and I would not rebuild them for their comfort. At work that same week, Daniel announced my promotion in front of the team, not quietly in a corner, but in the middle of a leadership meeting. And he explained that I would be heading a new internal program designed to make attribution transparent so that no one's work could be erased or miscredited again. As the applause rolled through the room, I felt an odd mixture of pride and relief, because the victory was not just about me climbing another rung, but about institutionalizing the very thing I had fought for privately for so long, recognition without theft. And in that moment I realized that my revenge, if you want to call it that, was not a single blow but a structural shift, a change that meant even if my family never admitted the truth, the professional world I had built would reflect it. A week later, at a family barbecue, the kind of event where Dad usually dominated the grill and Mom fluttered around making sure Ava's plate was always full, the tables turned in a way I could not have scripted better. Daniel stopped by briefly to drop off a bottle of wine as a thank you for my help with the pilot program, and in front of cousins and uncles and the very audience that had laughed at Dad's jokes for years, He congratulated me on the promotion and casually mentioned that I would be speaking at an upcoming public webinar on owning your work, a detail that landed like a stone in the center of the gathering. No one laughed this time, no one teased, and even Dad, who tried to mask his surprise with a stiff smile, could not spin it into a punchline. The silence that followed was worth every late night, every doubt, every moment I had swallowed bitterness, because for the first time the truth was undeniable in the very circle that had tried hardest to erase it. That evening, long after the guests had left and the leftover potato salad sat sweating in the fridge, my phone buzzed again. It was a message from Ava, not angry this time, not accusatory, just a short line that said she wanted the mentor call, that she was ready to start over if I still meant the offer. I stared at the words, surprised more than anything, and while I didn't know if it was the start of something real or just another attempt to reset the board, I felt a small satisfaction that the only way forward for her was through the accountability I had demanded. Dad, for once, did not make another real success joke, and though he didn't apologize, his silence was its own kind of concession. And that is where it ended, not with an explosion or a grand speech, but with the quiet certainty that I had turned the tables in a way that would hold. I had cut the strings, I had refused the script, and I had walked into the rooms that mattered, leaving behind the stage where I had been cast as the lesser sister. My family might never call it brilliant, but I didn't need them to. I had written the ending myself, and this time I won.